George McClellan was a brilliant military organizer and a cautious general who became one of the most controversial figures of the American Civil War. George McClellan, the second commanding general of the Union Army, was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on December 3, 1826. He came from a prominent and well-educated family. His father was a distinguished surgeon and founder of Jefferson Medical College. McClellan had a natural intelligence and a commanding presence. From an early age he showed exceptional academic promise. He was educated at private schools in Philadelphia where he excelled in mathematics and classical studies. At the age of 15, young McClellan entered the United States Military Academy at West Point, making him one of the youngest cadets ever admitted to the prestigious institution. He graduated second in his class in 1846, demonstrating his remarkable intellectual capabilities and his dedication to military science. George McClellan entered military service just as the United States was going to war with Mexico. The Mexican-American War would become McClellan's proving ground, his introduction to actual combat and military leadership. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers, one of the most elite branches of the Army. McClellan served with distinction under General Winfield Scott during the Mexico City campaign. He participated in the siege of Vera Cruz and fought in several major battles including Contreras, Churubusco, and Chapultepec. For his bravery and competence he was brevetted twice, promoted for gallantry in action to first lieutenant and then to captain. The young officer impressed his superiors with his engineering skills, his ability to reconnoiter enemy positions, and his coolness under fire. McClellan learned from Winfield Scott, absorbing lessons about military organization, logistics, and the importance of thorough preparation before launching campaigns. After the Mexican War ended in 1848, McClellan returned to a peacetime army where advancement was slow and opportunities for glory were limited. He spent several years on various engineering assignments, building fortifications along the Texas frontier and improving harbors and rivers. In 1855 the Army sent Captain McClellan to Europe as part of a military commission to study European armies, particularly to observe the Crimean War where Britain and France were fighting Russia. McClellan traveled extensively through Europe, observing military tactics, cavalry operations, and siege warfare. He studied the armies of Prussia, France, and Russia, taking detailed notes on their organization, equipment, and methods. Based on his observations he designed a new saddle for the U.S. cavalry, which became known as the McClellan saddle and remained in use for decades. He returned from Europe with enhanced prestige and a reputation as one of the Army's most knowledgeable officers on modern military affairs. Despite his success in the military, McClellan grew frustrated with the slow pace of promotion in the peacetime Army and the modest salary of an Army captain. In 1857 he resigned his commission to pursue opportunities in the civilian world. McClellan became chief engineer and later vice president of the Illinois Central Railroad, one of the most important railroad companies in America. He proved to be an excellent railroad executive, demonstrating the same organizational abilities that had made him a successful Army engineer. The railroad position made him wealthy and brought him into contact with prominent businessmen and politicians including Abraham Lincoln, who was then a lawyer for the Illinois Central. In 1860 McClellan moved to Cincinnati to become president of the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad, further advancing his business career. He married Ellen Marcy, the daughter of an Army officer, in 1860. Ellen was the love of his life and he wrote her lengthy letters throughout his career, letters that revealed his innermost thoughts, his ambitions, and his frustrations. When the Civil War erupted in April 1861 after the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, George McClellan immediately offered his services to his country. Several states competed for his talents. Ohio Governor William Dennison appointed him Major General of Ohio Volunteers, making him one of the first senior officers of the Union Army. Within weeks the federal government commissioned him as a Major General in the regular Army, a remarkable jump from his former rank of captain. McClellan was assigned to command the Department of the Ohio, responsible for the defense of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and for military operations in Western Virginia. In his first campaign McClellan led Union forces into the mountains of Western Virginia in the summer of 1861. His forces won several small but significant victories at Philippi, Rich Mountain, and Carrick's Ford, driving Confederate forces out of the region and securing Western Virginia for the Union. These victories, though minor in scale, were magnified by the Northern press starving for good news after months of Confederate successes. While McClellan was winning in Western Virginia, the main Union Army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. The Union Army under General Avin McDowell was routed by Confederate forces and fled back to Washington in chaos and confusion. The defeat shocked the North and created panic in the capital. President Lincoln needed someone to restore order, rebuild the shattered army, and defend Washington against what many feared would be an imminent Confederate attack. Lincoln turned to the young general who had won victories in Western Virginia. On July 26, 1861, George McClellan was summoned to Washington and given command of the Division of the Potomac, soon renamed the Army of the Potomac. At age 34, McClellan became responsible for organizing, training, and leading the primary Union Army in the Eastern Theater. George McClellan proved to be a brilliant organizer and trainer of troops. He threw himself into the task of building an army with tremendous energy and skill. He organized the mass of raw recruits and demoralized veterans into disciplined divisions, brigades, and corps. He established training programs, imposed military discipline, and created an efficient staff system. He improved the Army's logistics, ensuring that soldiers were properly fed, clothed, and equipped. He conducted grand reviews where thousands of soldiers marched in formation, building unit cohesion and pride. McClellan had a remarkable ability to inspire his soldiers. The troops loved him. They called him Little Mac. He would ride through the camps on his horse and the soldiers would cheer wildly. He gave them confidence. He made them feel like they were part of something important, part of a real army that could stand up to the rebels. Within months, McClellan had transformed a mob into what many considered the finest army on the American continent. His organizational genius was undeniable. No one could question his ability to build and train an army. But George McClellan had a fatal flaw as a military commander. He was excessively cautious. He was reluctant to commit his army to battle. He consistently overestimated the strength of enemy forces facing him, sometimes believing the Confederates had twice or three times as many soldiers as they actually possessed. He demanded more troops, more supplies, more time to prepare before he would advance. As fall turned to winter in 1861, pressure mounted on McClellan to take action, to move against the Confederate army that sat tantalizingly close to Washington. But McClellan insisted he was not ready. He needed more training, more equipment, more men. President Lincoln grew increasingly frustrated. The press began to criticize the general. The radical Republicans in Congress demanded action. But McClellan would not be rushed. He believed that hasty action would lead to disaster. He wanted overwhelming superiority before he would risk battle. In November 1861, the aging General Winfield Scott retired and McClellan was appointed General-in-Chief of all Union armies, making him the highest-ranking military officer in the nation. Now McClellan was responsible not just for the Army of the Potomac but for coordinating all Union military operations across the entire country. The dual responsibility proved too much. McClellan became overwhelmed with administrative details. His relationship with the Lincoln administration deteriorated. McClellan developed an arrogant attitude toward civilian authority. He referred to President Lincoln in private letters as the guerrilla and a well-meaning baboon. He kept the president waiting when Lincoln came to visit him. He ignored advice from the Secretary of War. McClellan believed that he alone understood military strategy and that the politicians should simply provide him with resources and stay out of his way. This attitude created powerful enemies in Washington. Finally, in March 1862, under intense political pressure, McClellan launched his long-awaited offensive against Richmond, the Confederate capital. Rather than marching directly south from Washington, McClellan devised a brilliant strategic plan. He would transport his entire army by ship down the Chesapeake Bay to Fort Monroe on the Virginia Peninsula, then march up the peninsula toward Richmond from the east. This Peninsula campaign was one of the largest amphibious operations in military history up to that time. Over 120,000 soldiers, thousands of horses, hundreds of artillery pieces, and vast quantities of supplies were loaded onto ships and transported to the peninsula. The logistical achievement was remarkable and demonstrated McClellan's organizational brilliance. The Peninsula Campaign began with great promise but ultimately ended in failure and frustration. McClellan's army landed successfully and began advancing up the peninsula in April 1862. But almost immediately McClellan's excessive caution reasserted itself. At Yorktown he encountered Confederate defensive fortifications manned by a relatively small Confederate force. Rather than attacking, McClellan insisted on conducting a formal siege, spending an entire month preparing his artillery and building siege works. This delay gave the Confederates time to concentrate their forces. When the Confederates finally abandoned Yorktown, McClellan pursued cautiously. At the Battle of Williamsburg his forces fought a sharp engagement, but McClellan failed to destroy the retreating Confederate army. By late May McClellan's army was within sight of Richmond. Church steeples in the Confederate capital were visible from Union positions. Victory seemed within grasp. Then everything went wrong for George McClellan. At the Battle of Seven Pines in late May, the Confederates attacked part of McClellan's army that was isolated south of the Chickahominy River. The battle was inconclusive, but the Confederate commander Joseph Johnston was severely wounded. President Jefferson Davis replaced Johnston with Robert E. Lee, a decision that would change the course of the war. Lee proved to be an aggressive, audacious commander, the opposite of the cautious McClellan. In late June Lee launched a series of attacks known as the 7 Days Battles. Though McClellan's army actually won most of the tactical engagements and inflicted heavier casualties on the Confederates, McClellan lost his nerve. Convinced he was outnumbered and in danger of being destroyed, he ordered a retreat. The Army of the Potomac withdrew down the peninsula to Harrison's Landing on the James River. The campaign to capture Richmond had failed. McClellan blamed everyone but himself. He blamed the Lincoln administration for not sending him enough reinforcements. He blamed his corps commanders for not being aggressive enough. He sent an insubordinate telegram to Secretary of War Stanton essentially accusing the administration of betraying the army. The failure of the Peninsula Campaign marked the beginning of the end of McClellan's military career. Lincoln lost confidence in him. In August 1862 Lincoln created a new Army of Virginia under General John Pope and began withdrawing troops from McClellan's command to reinforce Pope. McClellan was furious. He believed Pope was incompetent and that the administration was making a terrible mistake. Events proved McClellan partially right. In late August Robert E. Lee defeated Pope decisively at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Pope's army retreated in disorder back to Washington. The capital was again in danger. Lincoln faced a crisis. He needed someone to reorganize the demoralized troops and defend Washington. Despite his reservations, Lincoln turned once again to George McClellan. McClellan was restored to command of the forces defending Washington, though not as general-in-chief of all armies. George McClellan again demonstrated his remarkable ability to organize and inspire troops. Within days he had restored order and rebuilt the army's morale. In early September 1862 Robert E. Lee invaded Maryland, bringing the war into Northern Territory for the first time. McClellan marched out to meet him with a reorganized and confident Army of the Potomac. Then McClellan received an extraordinary piece of luck. Union soldiers found a copy of Lee's orders wrapped around some cigars at an abandoned Confederate campsite. Special Orders 191 revealed that Lee had divided his army into several separated columns. McClellan now knew Lee's plans and had an opportunity to defeat the Confederate forces in detail before they could reunite. But McClellan moved cautiously, slowly, giving Lee time to concentrate his forces. On September 17, 1862 the two armies collided at Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland in what became the bloodiest single day in American history. The Battle of Antietam was a tactical stalemate but a strategic Union victory. McClellan's attacks were poorly coordinated, launched piecemeal rather than simultaneously, allowing Lee to shift troops to meet each threat. McClellan kept an entire corps in reserve and never committed it to battle, even though doing so might have destroyed Lee's army. Still, Lee's invasion was stopped and he was forced to retreat back into Virginia. Lincoln used the Union victory at Antietam as the occasion to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war into a crusade against slavery as well as a fight to preserve the Union. After Antietam, McClellan again became cautious and refused to pursue Lee's battered army aggressively. He spent weeks reorganizing, resupplying, and preparing for the next campaign. Lincoln visited McClellan at the army's camp and urged him to advance. McClellan promised action but continued to delay. Lincoln's patience finally ran out. On November 7, 1862, Lincoln removed McClellan from command of the Army of the Potomac, replacing him with General Ambrose Burnside. McClellan's military career was over. He was 36 years old. He returned to his home in New Jersey to wait for orders that would never come. George McClellan remained popular with many soldiers and with Democratic Party politicians who opposed Lincoln's war policies and the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1864, the Democratic Party nominated McClellan as their candidate for president to run against Abraham Lincoln. The Democratic platform called for an immediate armistice and peace negotiations with the Confederacy, though McClellan himself repudiated that plank of the platform and insisted he would continue the war until the Union was restored. The 1864 election became a referendum on the war. In the summer of 1864, when the war was going badly for the Union, McClellan appeared likely to win. But then Union victories at Atlanta and in the Shenandoah Valley turned the tide. Lincoln won a decisive victory in November 1864, carrying all but 3 states. McClellan won only 21 electoral votes to Lincoln's 212. The soldiers themselves, the men who had loved Little Mac, voted overwhelmingly for Lincoln. They wanted to finish the war, not negotiate a peace that would leave the nation divided. After his defeat, McClellan traveled to Europe with his family, spending several years abroad. He returned to America in 1868 and became chief engineer of the New York City Department of Docks. He remained active in Democratic Party politics. In 1877, he was elected governor of New Jersey, serving 1 term from 1878 to 1881. As governor, he proved to be an honest and competent administrator, reforming the state's finances and supporting civil service reform. After leaving office, he worked as a writer and lecturer, defending his military record and his decisions during the war. He wrote his memoirs, McClellan's Own Story, which was published posthumously. The memoir was defensive and self-justifying, blaming others for his failures and claiming he had been betrayed by the Lincoln administration. George McClellan died of a heart attack on October 29, 1885 at his home in Orange, New Jersey. He was 58 years old. He was buried in Riverview Cemetery in Trenton, New Jersey. Thousands attended his funeral, including many veterans who had served under him in the Army of the Potomac. Even in death, McClellan remained a controversial figure. His supporters remembered him as a brilliant organizer who had been undermined by incompetent politicians. His critics remembered him as an overcautious general who had wasted opportunities and prolonged the war. History has generally sided with the critics. McClellan's excessive caution, his overestimation of enemy strength, his reluctance to take risks, and his insubordinate attitude toward civilian authority are seen as serious failures in military leadership. Yet his genuine accomplishments cannot be denied. He created the Army of the Potomac, transforming raw recruits into disciplined soldiers. He restored the Army's morale after devastating defeats. He stopped Lee's invasion at Antietam, giving Lincoln the victory he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. George McClellan was a man of remarkable talents and equally remarkable flaws, a general who could build an army but struggled to lead it into battle, a leader who inspired tremendous loyalty but could not deliver the decisive victories the Union desperately needed in the early years of America's bloodiest war.